My name is David Turner. I'm 54 years old, and until this morning, I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. After 28 years of service, I knew every corner of the Pentagon, every crack in the command chain, and every silence that said more than words ever could. It happened just before our quarterly strategy briefing. I was reviewing notes on a new deployment model, sipping cold coffee, when a knock came on the glass. Not a strong one. Just enough to announce something you already knew was bad news. I looked up to see a young officer, maybe fresh out of ROTC, barely old enough to rent a car. His face was stiff, almost apologetic, holding a manila envelope like it burned his hands. He said he was delivering a personnel update. I asked if he meant a staffing change. He just shook his head and passed me the envelope. Inside was a one-page memo stamped immediate retirement, effective today. No warning, no conversation, just a signature I didn't recognize, and the line where mine was supposed to go, already filled out. I looked at him for a long second. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked if this was a joke. He didn't answer. He just saluted, turned, and left the room. That was it. No thank you for your service. No handshake. Just a quiet erasure of nearly 3 decades of my life. The silence in that room was louder than anything I heard in combat. I didn't move. I just sat there with the memo in one hand and my pen still in the other, like the next note I was supposed to write would undo all of it. But it wouldn't. They'd made their move. Now it was my turn. The first sign was small. My calendar didn't include the monthly Joint Operations Committee meeting. I thought maybe it was a scheduling error, so I checked the briefing logs. My access had been quietly restricted. No message, no heads up, just gone. I told myself it was probably a system glitch, something technical, something fixable. But the second sign came 2 days later, and it cut deeper. A junior logistics officer came by my office with a data package meant for base allocation. She handed it to me, then paused like she wasn't sure if she'd made a mistake. She called me sir, but it felt practiced. Flat. The kind of respect you give someone you're no longer afraid of. I asked who had assigned her. She said, Major Marcus. That name didn't belong in my chain. I started watching more closely after that. In the operations portal, my name had been scrubbed from 2 ongoing briefings I was leading. Reports I submitted were rerouted without review. One even came back to me with red ink Marcus's handwriting, correcting strategy I'd written during a live conflict rotation in Kabul. The man had never deployed beyond Germany. Now he was cleaning my notes like he owned the playbook. People stopped stopping by. My inbox went quiet. The briefing room that used to be mine now had someone else's badge code on the lock. And no one said a word. They acted like this was how it had always been. But it wasn't real until I opened an internal PDF by mistake. I was clearing out review files when I found a document labeled Restructure Proposal Internal Only. I clicked it. Chain of command. New lines drawn. Titles shifted. And in the space where my name had lived for 8 years, there was nothing. Just a blank space replaced by a single line. Strategic Ops Lead, Major Marcus Ellison. I didn't react. I just stared. The name felt like a slow punch to the chest, not because it was him, but because I knew who he served. General Hamlin's handpicked golden boy. The same man who once told me quiet men like me were good at following, not leading. It all clicked then. The silence, the lock changes, the sudden cold shoulders. I'd been removed without being told. Deleted, not demoted. It was personal. But more than that, it was coordinated. They didn't just want me out. They wanted me to vanish like I was never there. And for a moment, I let myself feel it. That cold, rising heat in your chest when the people you gave everything to pretend they never needed you. I stood, closed the laptop, and looked around my office. My name still sat on the plaque, but now I knew it meant nothing. Not to them. But the one mistake they made, they forgot to lock me out before I saw what they were hiding. And that meant the game hadn't ended. It had just started. Before the titles and the desk with a view, I was a captain running recon logistics out of Kandahar. Nights were long, and the plans were written with coffee and instinct. We didn't have much, but we made it work because failure meant body bags. I learned early how to build order out of chaos, how to keep things moving when systems failed. That instinct stayed with me. Years later, when I moved into strategic command, I helped write the very doctrine that newer officers now treat as gospel. I ran joint force simulations that became real-world protocols, built the command framework for Western theater response. I wasn't just filling roles. I was laying bricks for a fortress they now pretend sprang up overnight. During my years in the reserve, I started something on the side, a defense consulting firm, nothing flashy, just a clean LLC with a name and a mission. Valor One. We drafted contingency models, advised on private sector logistics, reviewed foreign base contracts. It was steady work. Then came a promotion. Active duty took over, and Valor One went dormant. I kept the filings up to date just in case. I never thought that case would come. Last night, I dug out the lockbox from my basement. Inside was a file marked 2004. The original Valor One contracts. Among them, a consulting agreement with the Department of Defense. The language was stiff, old school, but one line made me stop cold. Clause 9b. In the event of suspected internal fraud or abuse of strategic operations, Valor One reserves the right to act as independent oversight until investigation is complete. I read it again, then again. I hadn't touched this clause in almost 20 years, but it was there. Still valid, still binding, still signed by the right people. Back then, we were trying to prevent abuse from the outside. Terror cells, insider threats. We never imagined the rot would come from within, but the clause didn't care where the threat came from. It only needed a trigger, and General Hamlin just gave me one. Valor One had been forgotten by most. It had never made headlines, but I kept it alive, quiet, compliant, legally spotless. I was the sole remaining founding officer with signature authority. That meant if I wanted to, I could reactivate the firm. And more importantly, I could enforce Clause 9b. I leaned back in my chair, holding the paper like it was something sacred. All these years, I'd assumed I left no fallback, but I had. Not in medals or plaques. In ink, in the fine print, no one ever reads. While they were busy building alliances in favor, I'd unknowingly left myself a door. It had rusted, maybe, but it wasn't shut. They thought I'd roll over, that I'd pack a box and fade into memory. But I built the infrastructure they were now standing on. And worse for them, I still had keys they didn't know existed. They forgot who built the fortress. Now they were about to learn what happens when you try to exile the architect. I made the first call just after midnight. Not to anyone on base, not to a colleague. I called Mark Feldman, a quiet name in Washington legal circles who'd handled Valor One's original incorporation paperwork back in 2002. He didn't ask questions, just said, "Give me 36 hours and a clean fax line." I gave him both. Then, I got to work. I pulled the original filings from my fireproof cabinet. EIN, Articles of Organization, state compliance forms. I flagged everything that needed updating. We didn't need to change much, just adjust the scope of operations. I had Mark revise the mission statement to emphasize strategic compliance, defense analytics, and operational oversight. It had to be vague enough not to raise red flags, but pointed enough to hold water if challenged. Within a day, we had fresh documentation filed through an expedited channel. Valor One was legally active again. A real company with a current agent on record, clean tax status, and a newly amended purpose statement. No one at the Pentagon would notice. They weren't looking for ghosts. Next, I turned to the contract archive. I digitized everything back in 2011 during a cleanup binge. Folder 19C held legacy government contracts. I found the one I remembered, dated August 2003. Memorandum of Understanding between Valor One and a Department of Defense Logistics Suboffice. Annex C detailed Valor One's role during strategic audits. But it was Clause 7A that caught my breath. In the event of suspected fraud or unauthorized alteration of mission-critical oversight, Valor One retains the right to initiate an independent review process in collaboration with military legal authorities. It didn't matter that the office no longer existed in the same form. What mattered was that the clause had been tied to the original terms of engagement, still active, still signed. Mark verified the signature chain, said it would hold. That was all I needed. I drafted a memo declaring reactivation of audit rights under Clause 7A, citing new information, suggesting internal misconduct. I didn't send it. Not yet. It wasn't time. I saved it under a decoy file name and moved it to an encrypted drive. I began building a digital infrastructure. Nothing public. A secure domain, encrypted cloud backups, basic staff profiles using initials and old project credits. The company looked alive from the outside. No one would dig deeper unless they had a reason. And no one had one. Yet, each step I took was slow, precise. No alarms, no footprints, just shadows moving through old corridors. I didn't need Valor One to be powerful. I needed it to be legal, recognized, quietly legitimate. A single clause in a forgotten contract gave me standing. That was enough. They had no idea what I was doing, no clue the man they tried to erase was building a lever they couldn't see. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, cold, ready. Because when the moment came to pull that lever, it wouldn't be personal. It would be protocol, ghost protocol. And I had just put it back online. I started with procurement. Simple forms, routed through legacy systems that hadn't been audited in years. I submitted a request for advanced communications hardware with a vague spec sheet and tagged it urgent, routed it to Marcus. I knew he wouldn't read it. He never read past the first page if the request looked technical enough. That was the first move. Then I built the dummy vendors. 3 shell entities, each with their own EIN, inbox, and placeholder websites. All legally filed, all invisible to a casual glance. The names sounded legitimate. Orion Tactical, Lambda Defense, Sierra Link Systems. I submitted introductory offers through official channels, marked competitive bids, and attached paperwork that would look just real enough under a quick skim. I knew Marcus wouldn't forward them for review. He'd authorize them to show initiative. Every approval triggered a new flag inside Valor One's internal monitor system. I designed it like a game board. One wrong move, and the signal lit up. One shortcut, and the log began compiling metadata. IP addresses, timestamps, approval chains. Each action added a layer of evidence. Not speculation, proof. Next, I reactivated access to the defense finance chain I helped build a decade ago. They hadn't revoked my admin permissions because no one remembered I had them. That was their second mistake. I used the clearance to access contract rotation data. From there, I identified where fraudulent invoices were most likely hiding. Then I made those categories louder. I injected small, legitimate errors into financial reports Marcus would review. Just enough to trigger a correction, not suspicion. He fixed them, took credit. Then followed the paper trail I quietly left behind. I fed him corrupted data that made him look smarter to his superiors. More prepared, more aggressive. It was a spotlight trap, and he stepped right into it. Simultaneously, I assigned Valor One to open an internal review on a maintenance vendor. A small, unassuming operation linked by address to a cousin of General Hamlin's aide. I filed the paperwork under routine audit, sent a copy to compliance, then I buried it beneath 6 layers of dull contracts so it wouldn't draw attention. Within a day, the aide moved money out of that vendor account. Every trigger gave me more visibility. Every shortcut they took made them easier to follow. I logged everything, kept backups in 3 locations. The legal team at Valor One stayed silent. Their job wasn't to interfere, just to validate what I found. Their signatures were all I needed when the time came. I never broke a rule. I never hacked a system. I walked through doors they left unlocked and made notes on what I saw. They thought I was gone. thought they'd buried me under politics and silence. But I was right there, watching, adjusting, tightening the net with every move they made. By week's end, I had a complete map of internal fraud paths, financial manipulation, and conflict of interest chains. Marcus looked cleaner than ever on paper. Confident, efficient. He didn't realize the very promotions he chased were building the timeline that would bury him. I didn't need them to confess. I just needed them to act like they always did. The difference now was simple. This time, I was writing the script, and every line ended the same way: exposure. The moment I stepped into the boardroom, the air changed. Not because anyone expected me, because no one did. General Hamlin paused mid-sentence. His aide glanced at the door like he wasn't sure I was real. I carried a folder in one hand and a USB drive in the other. No words. Not yet. I walked to the center table, laid the folder down, and plugged the drive into the main console. Screens flickered. Static. Then spreadsheets appeared. Transactions, approvals, email chains, the entire trail. Nobody moved. Hamlin straightened in his chair, trying to reclaim the room. He started to speak, but I cut him off with one sentence. "I'm not here to beg. I'm here to vote." A beat of silence. Then murmurs around the table. I turned to the board. Valor One, the defense oversight firm I co-founded during my reserve years, now holds active status under Clause 7A of the 2003 memorandum. Due to evidence of internal misconduct, it has been granted full review authority. That clause is still valid. Still binding, still mine. Hamlin leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "You were terminated. You don't even have standing." I looked him dead in the eye. "That's where you're wrong. You terminated me under false pretense to cover your tracks." That triggered the clause, and it gave me the very power you tried to erase. I tapped a key. The screen changed. Procurement logs, overpayments, dummy vendors, each one traced to accounts linked to Marcus or associates of Hamlin's staff. Audit trails confirmed approval dates, matching times when supposed reviewers were on assignment or leave. Timestamps don't lie, but generals sometimes do. Hamlin's jaw tensed. Marcus paled. Someone on the far side of the table whispered into a phone. "Probably legal." I let them squirm. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I let the evidence speak louder than I ever could. "This board is now in possession of documents proving fiscal misconduct," I said, tapping the folder, "including falsified reports, misuse of military funds, and obstruction of internal compliance processes." I watched the board chair flip through the pages. Her lips pressed tight. She didn't look at Hamlin. Another screen blinked on. A signed declaration from Valor One's legal team, authentication seals, notarized timestamps. Nobody could question it. They tried to delete me. What they didn't count on was that I built the systems they now use. Every shortcut left a fingerprint. Every lie, a breadcrumb. Hamlin finally spoke again. "This is a setup. You weaponized a dead company." My voice didn't rise. Valor One was never dead. It was waiting. And it has more standing today than your signature does. One of the younger board members leaned forward. "Sir, this evidence is damning." The chair cleared her throat. "I move that we suspend General Hamlin from duty, pending full investigation." All in favor? Hands rose. Clean. Silent. Every one of them, including the ones who used to nod politely and dismiss me. Hamlin didn't speak again. He didn't have to. His silence said it all. Marcus sank into his chair like he was disappearing into it. I picked up the flash drive, pocketed it, then looked around the table one last time. "You wanted me gone because I remembered where the rot started. Now you can't look away." I turned to leave. No applause, no ceremony, just quiet vindication. They had tried to erase me and handed me the matchbook instead. I stood there while they offered me the seat at the head of the table. The title, the authority, everything I had been pushed out to protect. I looked at each face, saw the panic hiding behind protocol, and shook my head. That was never what I came for. Instead, I reached into my jacket and pulled out a sealed letter. Inside was a single name, Captain Elise Monroe. Young, honest, the only one who spoke up during the last budget review, even when no one listened. She didn't have seniority, but she had integrity, and that mattered more. They didn't argue, not out loud. They were too stunned, too shaken to resist. A few nodded. One or two even looked relieved. I handed the envelope to the board chair, turned around, and walked out. No medal, no farewell speech. Just my boots on the same floor I'd walked for decades. Outside, the air felt colder than I remembered. Cleaner too. Maybe it was just the weight finally lifting. The base behind me buzzed with activity, but I didn't look back. They had enough to deal with. I had done my part. It wasn't revenge. It was a reminder that loyalty cuts both ways, that principles matter more than positions. They tried to erase me, but you don't erase a man by taking away his nameplate. You just remind him who he really is. I drove home with no music, just the hum of the engine and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd never forget what happened in that room. Not because I stayed to lead, but because I stood long enough to be heard.